Today on the show, we have a special guest for an extended conversation on a wide range of issues, from the war in Afghanistan to North Korea, Syria, Iran, Russia and the election, big tech companies and the role they play in our lives, propaganda, and beyond. Our guest is the legendary American dissident and scholar Noam Chomsky. I'm sure that pretty much every single one of our listeners is familiar with Chomsky, but you'll almost never see him on major TV networks in the United States. Globally, yes, Chomsky is on TV all the time around the world. But here in his home country, nope. And if I'm not mistaken, he has never been on NBC, ABC, CBS, or Fox. He did a few interviews over the years on PBS, on The Charlie Rose Show, and I believe he was on CNN for a couple of minutes once. Such is the fate of dissidents in the home of the brave. Here's one of the few times that Noam Chomsky was actually allowed on U.S. TV. It was way back on April 3rd, 1969, when Chomsky debated the famed conservative William F. Buckley. The show was broadcast under the title Vietnam and the Intellectuals, and it was part of Buckley's show Firing Line.
What seems to me a very, in a sense, terrifying aspect of our society and other societies is the equanimity and the detachment with which sane, reasonable, sensible people can observe such events. I think that's more terrifying than the occasional Hitler or LeMay or other that crops up. These people would not be able to operate were it not for this apathy and equanimity. And therefore I think that it's, in some sense, the sane and reasonable and tolerant people who share a very serious burden of guilt that they very easily throw on the shoulders of others who seem more extreme and more violent.
No, I agree, but
Noam Chomsky is one of the most popular and influential political thinkers in the world. Yet in the United States, you'll only find him on independent alternative media outlets. Look at all the pundits and, criminals who are constantly on TV today. The people with long public careers in mass killing or mass lying. This is part of the problem. It's a big part of the problem in this country. How different would this country be? Would the world be if Noam Chomsky and other principled dissidents were regularly featured on major news broadcasts? Chomsky is currently a laureate professor in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Arizona. He's professor emeritus at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he taught for more than half a century. Chomsky's recent books include Global Discontents, Conversations on the Rising Threats to Democracy, and Requiem for the American Dream, The 10 Principles of Concentration of Wealth and Power. He's also the co-author with the late Ed Herman of the classic book, Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of the Mass Media. Noam Chomsky, welcome to Intercepted.
Very glad to be with you.
If you watch, and I know you are not a fan of television news, but if you watch particularly MSNBC or CNN right now, or you read the major newspapers in the United States, you can come away with the impression that Donald Trump and his administration, his presidency, represent this grand departure from the way things are done in the United States historically. How much of a departure is the Trump presidency from the bipartisan Washington empire consensus, the way that the U.S. has been governed throughout its history?
There are some differences and many continuities. On the domestic scene, Trump is very effectively managing both of his constituencies. There's an authentic constituency of corporate power and private wealth, and they're being served magnificently by the executive orders, legislative programs that are being pushed through, which represent the more savage wing of the traditional Republican policies, catering to private interests and private wealth and dismissing the rest as irrelevant and easily disposed of. At the same time, he's managing to maintain the voting constituency by pretending very effectively to be the one person in the world who stands up for them against the hated elites. And this is quite an impressive con job. How long he can carry it off, I don't know. On the international scene, It's actually more interesting. He's being lambasted for taking positions which, in my view, are pretty reasonable. So, for example, in the case of Korea, the two Koreas last April 27th came out with a historic declaration in which they laid out fairly explicit plans for moving towards reconciliation, integration, and denuclearization of the peninsula.
Kim Jong-un made history today, becoming the first North Korean leader to set foot in the South since the Korean War began in 1950. He promised a new beginning as he met with South Korea's Moon Jae-in in the demilitarized zone between the two countries. The meeting marks the first summit between the Koreas in more than a decade.
And they pretty much pleaded with outsiders, that means the United States, to permit them to proceed, as they put it, on their own accord. And so far, Trump has not interfered with this very much, calling off temporarily at least the military exercises, which, as he correctly said, are highly provocative. He's been lambasted for that. But it's exactly the right position, I think. In the case of Russia, it's more complex. His policies have, in fact, been twofold. His administration has continued the policies of building up military forces on the Russian border, carrying out military maneuvers, increasing the tensions in an extremely dangerous part of the world. On the other hand, he has also taken somewhat conciliatory steps towards reducing tensions, and for that, again, he's been lambasted, though I think it's the right thing to do. On other matters, he's torn up important international agreements. The most significant was the Iran nuclear agreement.
I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. In a few moments, I will sign a presidential memorandum to begin reinstating U.S. nuclear sanctions on the Iranian regime. We will be instituting the highest level of economic sanction.
That's in isolation from the entire world in this case. And that's very serious. And the most serious of all, by far overshadowing everything else, is his pulling out of the Paris negotiations.
The Paris Climate Accord is simply the latest example of Washington entering into an agreement that disadvantages the United States to the exclusive benefit of other countries, leaving American workers, who I love, and taxpayers to absorb the cost in terms of lost jobs, lower wages, shuttered factories, and vastly diminished economic production. Thus, as of today, the United States will cease all implementation of the non-binding Paris Accord and the draconian financial and economic burdens the agreement imposes on our country.
Leaves the United States as the only country in the world which is refusing officially to take even small steps towards dealing with a true existential crisis. And that's combined with the domestic programs of rapidly increasing the use of the most dangerous fossil fuels, cutting back regulations on economy for automobiles, eliminating safety protections for workers and so on. All of that is just a race to disaster. And that's by far the most serious of the initiatives to undermine what's loosely called the international order. Raising questions about NATO, for example, is quite a reasonable thing to do. One might certainly ask why NATO even exists after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Not that there weren't questions before, there were. But the official story was that NATO was in place to defend the West against the Russian hordes, which, putting aside the validity of that claim, that was the official stand.
The Russian cynical blockade of Berlin had brought Europe to the brink of war. It was at last clear that only a strong alliance could deter them from further adventures. On 4 April 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed by Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Italy, Portugal, the United Kingdom, Iceland, Canada, and the United States. This union of 12 nations became known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or more simply, NATO.
After the Soviet Union collapsed, a fair question arose as to why NATO should survive. And what it did was, in fact, expanded all the way to the Russian border, initially under the first Bush, then extensively under Clinton, then by 2008 even offering to have Ukraine join NATO. That's an attack on Russian geostrategic interests that no Russian leader could easily accept. All of this increases threats, tensions, quite unnecessarily. At the same time, NATO changed its official mission to what they call safeguard, control the international energy system, pipelines and sea lanes, and though it's unmentioned, to serve as essentially an intervention force for the United States. We have a good indication of how the world saw that international order. The Gallup polling agency takes international polls of international opinion every year. In 2013, for the first time, they asked an interesting question. They asked the question, which country is the greatest threat to world peace? The United States was in first place. No other country was even close, far behind. In second place was Pakistan. That was doubtless inflated by the Indian vote. The countries that are called the greatest threat to world peace here in the United States, like Iran, were barely even mentioned. Interestingly, Gallup never asked that polling question again, and the answer was not reported in the mainstream press.
You bring up the issue of NATO, and of course, right now in the United States, when Vladimir Putin is discussed, there is a lot of resurrection of kind of Cold War imagery. There are books being published with backwards R's on them, which isn't even in Cyrillic. It's not even actually the letter R. But there's this sort of portrayal of Putin as sort of the Bolsheviks rising, and this, idea that Russia is seeking to take over the United States, and Russia is responsible for Donald Trump being president because they, quote unquote, hacked our election. What is true and what is hyperbole, propaganda, exaggeration about Russia and Putin specifically, taking into account the U.S. posture toward Ukraine, NATO, but also the issue of electoral interference?
What is true is that after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990, 1991, there was a period under Yeltsin in which the United States pretty much dominated what was happening in Russia and the region around Russia. NATO was expanded. The Russian economy totally collapsed under the imposed harsh market reforms. There was a radical collapse of the economy, a sharp increase in the mortality rate. Russia was really devastated. When Putin came in, he's not a nice guy. I would not like to have dinner with him, but you can understand his policies. His policies were to try to restore some role for Russia, at least in its own region of the world, which we might recall happened to be the traditional invasion routes through which Russia was attacked, virtually destroyed several times in the last century. So this is not a small question. And yes, Putin is trying to restore some degree of Russian power in the world, some degree of Russian authority. One extension of that, and in fact the only one, is the Russian position in Syria. All of this encroaches on the global domination of the United States and secondarily its allies, which is kind of taken to be the norm. The norm is we rule everything. And if someone else tries to control their own area, that's disruptive of the international system, which from a certain point of view it is. If you take a look at Russian power as compared with the United States, it's derisory. Just one indication, his increase in defense budget practically reaches the entire Russian military budget. So the idea of Russia taking over the world is ludicrous. What it means is that they're trying, often in ways that merit condemnation, but nevertheless trying to restore some degree of Russian influence in the regions surrounding Russia, plus Syria, their one Mediterranean base, and to try to establish a place for Russia in the world system, far weaker than the United States, weaker than China, in fact. One of Russia's international problems is to keep from being overwhelmed by Chinese power. That's the kind of disruption of the international order that is attributed to Russia.
You raised this issue of Russia in Syria, of course, the United States, Iran, Turkey, Qatar, the list of countries involved actively in the, just generically, let's call it the Syrian war right now. You do have a debate on the left in the United States about what a sort of just position looks like toward the conflict in Syria. And of course, you have isolationists or libertarians or anti-imperialists who take the position of there should be total hands-off Syria, that this is a civil war. I think the honest among us would say that, of course, Bashar al-Assad is a war criminal. He is a mass murderer, but he is in a conflict with a lot of mass murderers and a lot of war criminals. What, Noam Chomsky, do you believe is a just position to take on the war in Syria? Is it that people should defend Bashar al-Assad with the idea that it's the least bad option, or that this is a matter that should be handled by the Syrians? Or is there any international involvement that you think makes any sense or could be justified under both moral principles and legal principles?
Well, the first point to bear in mind, which you already mentioned, is that Assad is a horrible war criminal. The bulk of the atrocities, which are enormous, are his responsibility. There's no justifying Assad. On the other hand, the fact of the matter is that he is essentially and pretty much in control of Syria now, thanks largely to Russian, partially Iranian support. The Russians actually entered Syria extensively after the CIA had provided the rebel forces, which are mostly run by jihadi elements, provided them with advanced anti-tank missiles, which were stymieing the Syrian army, at which point the Russians came in with air power and overwhelmed the opposition. The current situation is that Assad has pretty much won the war, like it or not. There was, in the early stages, democratic, secular, quite respectable opposition, but they were very quickly overwhelmed by jihadi elements supported from the outside, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United States, and others. There's a pending humanitarian catastrophe in Idlib province where the jihadis have been the place to which they've been expelled or fled. If there's a Syrian-Russian attack on that, it could be a total humanitarian catastrophe. There's some indication that the Russians and the Turks may have been provided a safe area to which maybe some civilians can flee, but that looks like a monstrosity developing. If there's a way of countering that attack, it should be pursued by diplomatic means. The other crucial question is the status of the Kurdish areas, Rojava. In my opinion, it makes sense for the United States to maintain a presence which would deter an attack on the Kurdish areas. They're the one part of Syria which has succeeded in sustaining a functioning society with many decent elements, and the idea that they should be subjected to an attack by their bitter enemies, the Turks, or by the murderous Assad regime, I think anything should be done to try to prevent that.
Let me ask you about that point, because you are one of the leading people in the world that is consistently reminding the world that the United States has always adopted a posture of certain Kurds are good Kurds, certain Kurds are bad Kurds, and the United States has poured money and weapons into the coffers of, for instance, the Turkish military explicitly to be used for an ongoing attempt at genocide against the Kurds. So I'm curious how you reconcile that with a position that the United States would, in essence, be the protector of the Kurds in the context of the Syrian war.
The United States, like other great powers, does not pursue humanitarian objectives. It pursues objectives determined by power considerations, and they lead to different positions with regard to the Kurds or others at different times. So, for example, in the 1970s, there was a time when the United States supported Kurds against Saddam Hussein. Shortly after, a deal was made in which they sacrificed the Kurds to Saddam Hussein. That led to Henry Kissinger's famous comment that we shouldn't confuse foreign policy with missionary activity. It's entirely true that, especially in the 1990s, Clinton was pouring arms into Turkey for the purpose of carrying out massive, murderous, destructive attacks against the Kurdish population of Turkey in the southeast, enormously destructive. That does not change the fact that now the United States could, with a relatively small presence, deter attacks against the Kurds in Syria, which could destroy the one part of Syria that is actually functioning in a decent fashion. We don't expect consistency in humanitarian terms from a great power, because those are not the guiding principles.
Regarding Afghanistan, we're now 17 plus years in Afghanistan in the context of 9/11. Shouldn't we be talking about Afghanistan as obviously a war that the United States should have never started, and secondarily, that the United States has actually been militarily and politically defeated in Afghanistan?
Well, my own view, as you may recall, at the time, was that the use of military force in Afghanistan was inappropriate and illegitimate. There were diplomatic options. They could have been pursued, but the United States wanted to use force. I think perhaps the most accurate description of what the United States did was by Abdul Haq, one of the most respected and honored of the Afghan anti-Taliban activists, who in fact was killed in Afghanistan, who strongly opposed the U.S. bombing, as most of the Afghan dissidents did, and argued that the United States was bombing just because it wanted to show its muscle and intimidate everyone else, and it was undermining the efforts of the anti-Taliban Afghan resistance to solve the problem on their own.
Working their way through the rush hour that morning, two men were about to offer the U.S. government the chance to topple the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, to expel al-Qaeda from its terrorist bases, and to capture Osama bin Laden. This plan had been put together by Abdul Haq, one of Afghanistan's most respected leaders, and was the culmination of Haq's lifetime struggle to save his country.
I think his analysis was correct. We've now gone through 17 years of failed attempts to impose a U.S.-dominated system. There is an Afghan peace movement. It's not enormous, but it's significant. It's been there for several years. We should be doing what we can to support it, to lead them to find a solution internal to Afghanistan, reconciling to the extent possible the conflicting, warring factions. They're ethnically divided in other terms. It's an extraordinary problem. The most we can do is to try to facilitate efforts among the Afghans. I don't think there's much that the United States can hope to do beyond that. And the idea of imposing a military solution looks out of the question.
Do you believe it's accurate to say that the United States has been militarily defeated in Afghanistan?
Well, certainly it has not achieved any of its objectives after a huge expenditure, so give it whatever name you like. I mean, a great power like the United States never really gets defeated. It may not achieve its maximal objectives. So, for example, let's take Vietnam. It's almost universally described as a U.S. defeat. But if you look back at the original planning, this goes back to the early 50s, for why the United States became involved in Vietnam, turns out it wasn't a complete defeat. The U.S. did not achieve its maximal objectives of turning Vietnam into something like the Philippines, but it did achieve its major objective of preventing an independent South Vietnam from becoming a model that might be followed by others towards a successful independent development, perhaps eroding the whole Southeast Asia, East Asia order, which is what the planners were concerned with in the early 1950s, and that was in fact stopped. Power like the United States is unlikely to face anything like a real defeat, a failure perhaps.
I wanted to also make sure to ask you about this ongoing slaughter in Yemen. Recently, CNN and some of the other networks have started showing images of U.S. missile parts from munitions that, for instance, killed an entire bus full of school children recently.
This video of shrapnel was filmed in the aftermath of the attack and sent to CNN by contact in Sada. A cameraman working for CNN subsequently filmed these images for us. Munitions experts tell CNN this was a US-made Mark Mk-82 bomb, weighing in at 500 pounds. The first 5 digits there are the cage number, the commercial and government entity number. This number here denotes Lockheed Martin, one of the top US defense contractors.
But there was a dearth of that kind of reporting when Obama was waging what started as a secret, deniable bombing campaign. He kicked it off in December of 2009 with a cluster bomb attack that killed 36 women and children in the village of Al-Majla in Yemen, and then regularly was hitting Yemen with drone strikes. But it also is often portrayed as kind of Trump supporting the Saudis, when in reality, the U.S. first bombed Yemen in November of 2002. This has been going on for quite a long time. What is the U.S. motivation for this mass slaughter in Yemen right now that is primarily being carried out by Saudi warplanes that were given to the Saudis by the United States? And of course, the U.S. is doing all the intelligence assistance, the refueling, and the providing of munitions. But what is the U.S. agenda in Yemen, as you can see?
The U.S., and you're quite right in tracing this back to Obama, in fact, even earlier, the United States wants to ensure that Yemen will be incorporated within the system of reactionary Arab states that the U.S. dominates and largely controls. That's Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, which is quite a significant military power by the standards of the region and quite vicious and brutal. The Houthi presumably get some degree of Iranian support. To regard that as the Iran as the major threat in the region is ridiculous. The U.S. and secondarily Britain have been arming and supporting the military forces and actions of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, with the consequences that you describe. It's becoming one of the worst humanitarian disasters in the world. The attack on the port, the Hudaida port.
Coalition forces are closing in, and the fighting around the airport has blocked a key exit out of the city, making it harder to transport much-needed food aid from Hodeidah, the country's largest port, to the rest of the country. 8.4 million Yemenis are already at risk of starvation. The war has created the world's worst humanitarian crisis.
We can trace this back much farther, if you like. So back in the early 1960s, there was a war, a proxy war, going on in Yemen between Saudi Arabia and Egypt. At that point, Egypt was the center of secular Arab nationalism under Nasser and regarded as the main enemy by the United States. Saudi Arabia was the center of radical Islam. And very much like the British before us, the United States has tended systematically to support radical Islamism against secular nationalism. That war was raging right through the 60s. It was a significant war. Israel settled that problem for the United States and Saudi Arabia by smashing secular Arab nationalism in 1967. And that, in fact, is the major turning point in U.S.-Israeli relations. Israel performed a great service to the United States and its Saudi Arabian ally, and the radical Islamism that's centered there, by eliminating the secular nationalist alternative. And since then, U.S. relations with Israel have been kind of unique, even historically, but certainly in the modern world. And this is now another continuation of it with different cast of characters slightly. But Yemen has been regarded as it's the poorest of Arab states, the most miserable in many ways, torn by all sorts of internal conflicts. And the U.S. continues to be committed to trying to ensure that its close allies, the radical Islamist states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, maintain control against any adversary. Egypt at that time, Iran, which is a very minor participant, in fact, not like Egypt, which had a major army there, very minor participant in this case.
I'm sure that you paid attention to the reporting around National Security Advisor John Bolton's speech at the Federalist Society, in which he launched this blistering attack on the International Criminal Court, the ICC. And of course, John Bolton has always been against international law and its application to the United States. But Bolton did point something out in that speech that I think is important for people to understand, and it's accurate. Bolton described how in 2002, the U.S. Congress, in a bipartisan fashion, passed legislation that was known in human rights circles as the Hague Invasion Act.
This law, which enjoyed broad bipartisan support, authorizes the president to use all means necessary and appropriate, including force, to shield our service members and the armed forces of our allies from ICC prosecution. It also prohibits several forms of cooperation between the United States and the court.
Such radical right-wingers as Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden and many powerful Democratic senators, they actually voted for that legislation. And yet, when Bolton does his attack on the ICC, it was portrayed as, oh my God, look at how these Trump people are so outside of the norm. But the reality, isn't it true, is that this has been the bipartisan power consensus from the very beginning, that no international law should actually apply to the United States. And both Republicans and Democrats, including the Democrats' nominee in 2016, believe that the United States would have a right to militarily intervene to prevent a war crimes prosecution of any of its personnel.
You're absolutely correct. In Europe, as you say, it's called the Netherlands Invasion Act, authorizes the president to use military force, as they put it, to rescue any American who might be brought to trial anywhere. So you're quite correct. It's unfair to blame this position on Trump and Bolton. It goes way back, and it goes much farther back than that. So, for example, let's go back to 1984. The United States in 1984 was by the World Court, was ordered to terminate what was called unlawful use of force, which means international terrorism, against the state of Nicaragua, and to pay very substantial reparations.
Ducking the World Court on the question drew barbs, too, on the House floor.
Mr. Speaker, many of us have known for some time that the Reagan administration's Central America policies couldn't stand the light of day. But now the administration is admitting as much. By refusing to accept the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice over the CIA's mining of Nicaraguan ports, the administration has demonstrated that it knows that its policies can't withstand an inquiry by an impartial, objective international body.
The U.S. rejected the authorization of the World Court and did so with the strong support of liberal America. So the New York Times, for example, had an editorial condemning the court as what it called a hostile forum and therefore illegitimate. It was a hostile forum because it condemned the United States. 3 years earlier, the New York Times had lauded the World Court as a marvelous forum because it supported the United States in a claim against Iran. But now it was a hostile forum and therefore illegitimate, so the U.S. had no need to pay any attention to its orders. In fact, the U.S. even went so far as to veto a Security Council resolution, basically calling on states to observe international law. Didn't mention the United States, but it was obvious what the intent was. All of this with the support of liberal opinion across the board. Now, at that time, the United States was not alone in defying the World Court. I think Libya and Albania had also rejected World Court decisions, but they later accepted them. So the United States, as far as I'm aware, is now in splendid isolation in having rejected a decision of the World Court. And that's entirely consistent with the 2002 legislation authorizing the executive to use military force to block any act against Americans by the International Criminal Court, if that's even conceivable.
Just parenthetically, I don't want to get into this, but I do think it's worth just mentioning it, that when victims of the U.S. torture program, the so-called extraordinary rendition program, or people that were taken to Guantanamo or to black sites, filed lawsuits in the United States against Donald Rumsfeld, President George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, or other officials for the torture that they endured or the kidnapping that they endured, the Justice Department intervened in those cases using something called the Westfall Act, which actually has to do with U.S. labor law. And even Attorney General Eric Holder, under Obama, filed briefs in these lawsuits against Bush-era accused war criminals, saying that even if they had committed genocide, that it was within the official scope of their duties, and therefore they were removed as defendants in those cases and replaced by the U.S. government, which has sovereign immunity, and therefore they were dismissed. So it's not just on a level of international war or conflict. It's also on an individual level with U.S. officials. The position of the Justice Department, including under Obama, was that even if Donald Rumsfeld was involved with genocide, it would have been within the official scope of his duties, and therefore he cannot be held individually responsible for it.
Yeah, that's a kind of a counterpart to the fact that the U.S. did add a reservation to the Genocide Convention when it signed it finally, saying we're immune. Incidentally, on the torture program, there's more to be said. Actually, there's good studies of this by Alfred McCoy, an outstanding historian who did some of the major work, among other things, on the history of torture.
He's a great friend of this show and has been on several times. He also was my professor when I was briefly an undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin.
Okay, so I don't have to laud him to you. Done excellent work. But on torture, he pointed out that when the United States signed the International Torture Convention, I think it was 1984 or so, the Senate rewrote the convention to exclude the modes of torture that were carried out by the CIA, and that was then instituted into law under Clinton. So you could argue that much of the torture carried out under the Bush administration was actually not in violation of U.S. law. As McCoy also points out, the significant difference between the Guantanamo, Bagram, Abu Ghraib torture and earlier periods was that in earlier periods, the U.S. supervised the torture and trained the torturers in Latin America, Southeast Asia. But for this time, the U.S. Personnel were actually involved directly in the torture instead of supervising it and training the torturers. So that's a slight change, but from a moral point of view, not a very significant one.
I do want to make sure to get your sense of what's happening right now regarding the United States and Venezuela. Of course, you had Nicolas Maduro supposedly surviving a drone strike. Also, these generals, mutinous generals, it appears, meeting with the Trump administration to plot a coup, coordinate. It's unclear exactly what's happening, but it does seem as though the United States is trying to once again foment either a coup or a removal of Nicolas Maduro, Hugo Chávez's successor.
My sense of this is that the United States would support a coup, but not that it's really trying to instigate it. After all, in the year 2002, there was a military coup in Venezuela, which briefly overthrew the government, eliminated parliament, Supreme Court. It was reversed by a popular uprising. But during the time of the coup, the United States openly and quite publicly supported the military coup, as did the liberal press. There was a time back in the 1960s, 1970s, when the U.S. was, in fact, in a position to implement and strongly support military coups right throughout the continent. This traces back to a decision by John F. Kennedy in 1962 to change the mission of the Latin American military from what was called hemispheric defense. That was a holdover from World War II, anachronistic, from hemispheric defense to internal security. And in the Latin American context, internal security means war by the military and paramilitaries against the civilian population. Now, in 1962, the U.S. was in a position to shift the mission of the Latin American military. And in fact, essentially to prepare what became the first major military coup, 1964 in Brazil, then others, one country after another, Chile, Uruguay, finally Argentina, the worst of them, strongly supported by Kissinger and Reagan, then on to Central America. But the U.S. just doesn't have that power anymore. One thing that's happened in recent years is that Latin America has, to a certain extent, extricated itself from imperial, meaning recently U.S. control. This shows in many ways, like largely expelling the IMF, which for Latin America is a branch of the Treasury Department, eliminating the formal U.S. military bases. So the U.S. is doubtless involved, and it will continue to support the traditional policies, but not with the degree of power it once had. In the case of Venezuela, if there were to be a military coup, I don't doubt that the U.S. would support it, maybe with some clicking of tongues about how it's not a nice thing. But short of that, I think the U.S. is likely to continue with subversion and sabotage and support for the right-wing elements. On the other hand, it should be pointed out that Venezuela is a major disaster at this point, partly for external reasons, but considerably for internal reasons.
This year's 30 years since you and the great late Ed Herman published Manufacturing Consent, the Political Economy of the Mass Media. And I wanted to get your thoughts on the role that huge social media companies play in our society, given that they are replacing a lot of news organizations or the way that changing the way people consume information. Google, Facebook, Twitter, etc. There's a lot of talk about this. There's hearings on Capitol Hill. There's a lot of pleading with the billionaires to kick certain people off of social media, remove their accounts. What about the way that these entities, the Facebooks, Googles, Twitters of the world, have changed us as people and our society and the way we process, disseminate, absorb information?
Well, your words, process and disseminate and absorb, are correct, but not produce. The source of information remains the major media, the correspondents on the ground, who often do excellent and courageous and very valuable work. Facebook and the rest may filter information that they get from those sources and present it in ways which much of the public finds it easier to digest. I don't think that's a healthy development, but it is happening. And that means essentially dividing much of the population, much discussion of this, into cocoons, into bubbles in which they receive the information conducive to their own interests and commitments. If you read a major newspaper, say the New York Times, you get a certain range of opinion. It's narrow. It's basically centrist to far right, but at least it's a range of opinion. Those who are more addicted to social media tend to turn directly to what supports their own views, not to hear other things. That's not a good thing. Google, Facebook, and the rest, those are commercial institutions. Their constituency is basically advertisers, and they would like to establish the kinds of controls over their consumers that will be beneficial to their business model, enable them to get advertising. That has very serious distorting effects. And we know that they provide massive information to the corporate system, which they use for their own in their own efforts to try to shape and control behavior and opinion. All of this is a dangerous development. The power of these private corporations to direct people in particular directions and so on, that's a serious problem, which requires considerable thought and attention.
In all of the decades of debating these issues and campaigning for human rights and against U.S. wars, have things changed, and is it worth it to spend a lifetime doing what you've done for young people that are listening?
I think if we look over the years, we can see that there has been considerable achievements in changing public attitudes with regard to aggression, human rights, civil rights, and so on. I don't take credit for that. Plenty of people are involved, plenty of activists, many of them young. But the changes are very significant. Let's go back to the 1960s. In the 1960s, Kennedy escalated the war in 1961 and 62. Now, that's when Kennedy authorized the U.S. Air Force to begin directly bombing rural South Vietnam, authorized napalm, chemical warfare to destroy crops and livestock, organized mass programs to drive much of the peasantry into what amounted to concentration camps, strategic hamlets, huge escalation. What was the public reaction? Zero. At the time, if I wanted to give a talk about it, I'd talk in somebody's living room or something like that. There was no protest. In fact, for years, it was difficult or even impossible to have public meetings. In Boston, which is a liberal city, public meetings were violently broken up with the support of the press. Churches were attacked and so on. In fact, it wasn't until about 1967 that a large-scale opposition to the war developed. And by that time, South Vietnam had been practically destroyed, and the war had expanded to the rest of Indochina. Well, finally, there was a public reaction. In 1981, the Reagan administration came in and attempted to duplicate what Kennedy had done in the early 60s, almost step by step. They intended to essentially invade Central America. White paper blaming the international communists, huge propaganda campaign, and so on. It was almost instantly aborted by popular opposition. There was such massive popular opposition from popular groups, from the churches and others, that they had to back off. What happened was awful enough, but it wasn't Vietnam. They had to turn to bringing in other states like Taiwan, Israel, Argentine neo-Nazis to try to carry out the atrocities. The U.S. couldn't do it directly. That's very significant. Let's go on to 2003, when the U.S. invaded Iraq, the worst crime of this century. That's the first war in the history of imperialism in which the war was massively protested before it was officially launched. That's never happened before. Now, it's commonly said that the opposition failed, but I don't agree. That restricted the kinds of military actions that the U.S. was able to carry out. Again, horrible enough, but nothing like Vietnam. Well, all of these are indications of, and there are many others, of shifts of popular attitudes towards aggression, intervention, human rights violations, and so on, which make a difference. They haven't gone far enough, but there's a considerable improvement.
Well, Noam Chomsky, thank you very much for being so generous with your time. We really appreciate you being with us on Intercepted.
Good. Glad to be with you.
Noam Chomsky is one of the leading dissidents in the United States. He's currently laureate professor in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Arizona and professor emeritus at Massachusetts Institute of Technology.